This is actually a great time to be having this forum today, because we are in the journalism school on the path to being able to allow our students to do more and more in radio. We've been we've only had a real radio program for about 3 years, and it's been growing. So Marcia is somebody who can really speak well to the growth of public radio. Marcia has been pretty much, I'd say, a fixture in the public radio world for, I'm not going to say how many years, okay? 40. Okay, almost 40 years. Yeah. She launched Alaska's first daily statewide radio news program and managed the design and construction of a project that interconnected the Alaska Public Radio system via satellite, which is, I'm sure you know, a pretty big undertaking. She also helped design and launch the radio travel show called The Savvy Traveler for Marketplace, which was a very popular travel show, and we were talking last night, the day before there were travel shows on, every hour. She founded the Public Radio Program Directors Association, which is a really interesting group that gets together every year, right? Marcia, they get together every year, every two. She was their first national chair. But I'd say some of her, even though she did quite a bit of work at stations around the country, that the work that she's been doing on studying and defining the audiences that listen to public radio and what appeals to them about the public radio format has been some of the most important work for actually everybody who works in the radio sector. She designed the Core Values Project that looked at the core values of public radio, local news, and talk information programming, and importantly, I think, the value of localism. And out of this work, she authored several publications. One was the Public Radio Program Director's Handbook and the Public Radio Talk Show Handbook. Most recently, she headed NPR's Local News Initiative, which developed training projects and online resources to strengthen local news at public radio stations around the country. And given that the increasing importance of hyper-local news in the online world, the public radio system definitely was sort of a forerunner to this idea. She's not a stranger to LA. She lived here for many years and worked here, but she now is in Portland, Oregon, so she doesn't see the sun as much as she used to, but we're really happy to have her here.
It's sort of a classic. Thank you for having me here today. I'm going to talk about, a vigilant curiosity about the world is really a phrase I borrowed from the New York Times. It originally came from them talking about their audience, and of course there's a tremendous overlap between the readership of the New York Times and listening to public radio. It's really the defining characteristic, I think, of the audience, as you'll see. I'm going to talk about the promise and the pitfalls of local coverage. This is something that has a lot of promise and a lot of opportunity, but unless it is done properly, it really will get us absolutely nowhere with the audience. And we have found that out in study after study. And finally, does local matter? This is a very serious question that was debated for a long time in public radio, because the programs that really propel the audience, as you will see, tend to be the nationally distributed shows. And the driver of public radio's success has not been its local programming. And there were people for quite a time in public radio who basically just said, shut up and run the network. Why, don't bother with this local stuff. This is where your audience, this is the stuff your audience really likes, so why bother? The public radio was really created to serve community, to serve place, and that's really the mission and the charge. And I always felt, as somebody who had worked at stations in upstate New York, or Alaska, Seattle, that local does matter. But again, it really depends on how it's done, and we'll talk about some of the nuances of that as we go along. First of all, does radio matter? We've all heard a lot about the death of radio, and radio's over. This is something that's been said many times in radio's past. And I just wanted to show you 10-year trends in terms of a variety of media sources and what's happening. As you can see below the line, really struggling is both daytime cable television and primetime cable television, which have lost enormous amounts of audience. Network news television is down 30% over 10 years. Newspapers, a combined 30% split out with the Sunday edition down 17 and weekday down 13. Meantime, all of public radio, that means everything except what you see in the demonstrated in the red bar, is up 25% over the last 10 years, and NPR programming, excluding their hourly newscasts, is up an astonishing 58% at a time when there's just tremendous erosion across media consumption. So it's really a tremendous success story. So we'll talk a bit about that and how, without any advertising and no R&D budget and very little research, public radio has managed to really become an astonishing success story. Not that it's without its problems. What you are looking at is the largest locally owned and operated network in the world. These are all the NPR member stations. For those of you in journalism, this is going to be one of your prime employment opportunities as you leave this institution. I think there's going to be a real sea change in public radio. We're all getting older. Eventually, they will all leave. And there's also a tremendous amount of new, exciting initiatives that are being launched in terms of local news. So this is a real opportunity. And because of this locally owned, rooted in communities across the country system, it's something that should really give us a tremendous advantage in terms of local news. But until quite recently, it wasn't. The Local News Initiative, which I worked on for 4 years, looked at a variety of things. It was fun because it was really experimental. We were trying a lot of different things. The first thing that was done was a survey of local news stations to just try to figure out what the capacity is. Capacity versus aspiration. And what we found is local station news departments are just tremendously under-resourced. And that, of course, is one of the main problems, that it's hard to produce at a consistently high level of quality. If you don't have enough people, if you don't have enough money, it's really hard to do that. At the same time, stations were wanting to add more and more programming, which is kind of a recipe for disaster. If you have fewer and fewer people, and you're doing more and more programming, it's just going to make it harder and harder to make them really good all the time. So that was really the baseline of what we were looking at. Now, this is not true, of course, across the system. There are some stations that are very highly resourced, but a great many of them are not. So one of the things that we did was the very first training that was ever done for the people who anchor Morning Edition at local stations. This had never been done before. This is public radio's most listened to program. It is the most important program by virtue of the way people use radio, very much driven by morning drive, secondarily by afternoon drive. And this was an incredibly successful effort. Because not every station could attend, we also created, you can see down there, Meg's Toolkit, the Morning Edition Grad School Toolkit, which is online. And all of the major learning lessons from that are now available to anybody who wants to take a look at them. The Hubs projects were experiments in resource collaboration, in the ways stations could work together and NPR stations could work together to do kind of exciting projects. And a couple of examples of hubs that we did. One was one that focused on state house reporting, because public radio is getting close to being, the last person standing in state press rooms. It's a really devastating beat, and it's an incredibly important beat. So we looked at that, and we really figured out kind of what the quality of that is. We weren't happy with what we found. We looked at why that's happening, and I think a lot of good information came out of that. And another hub was the Northeast Environmental Hub, which is a multi-state collaboration that looks at the environment, an incredibly important issue for the public radio audience, from the perspective of a lot of different places. So it's not, when you hear pieces that are done through the Northeast Environmental Hub, which is still operating, it's not just one-offs. There's a managing editor who's always looking for connectivity and threads to provide context. It's happening here, it's happening there. And I really encourage them to get in touch with CBC and see if they can't work with some reporters up there, because not only do environmental issues not recognize state boundaries, they don't really recognize international boundaries either. So, and finally, exploring a sense of place, which was a huge research project. I think of all the work that's been done, that is the richest in terms of information. It's, if you were, a sense of place presentation takes about an hour and a half, so we're going to be skipping over a lot of things in the next 20, 25 minutes or so. But that was a major research project, and out of that came a second research project which looked at localism and morning edition, tying those two projects together, doing the first real-time testing of listener response to the local inserts in morning edition. Fascinating study, two different methodologies, very resonant findings, very cool stuff. So, why me? Why did NPR hire me as a consultant to head up this project? Willa mentioned the Core Values Project, and that is a project that had 6 different studies. I started it in 2000 because I was with this Programmers Association. We're looking at the problem of why is local programming not doing as well? Why isn't it as good as it should be? And the mission of our organization was to define and advocate principles of quality public radio programming. We wanted to improve the quality of the local programming, the member stations, roughly 200 member stations we're doing, and to really clearly define and articulate the fundamental appeal of our programming. We had no language at that time to talk about quality. We didn't, just like, well, I like that, I don't like that. I mean, fairly crude measures. And as an organization, we were giving out awards because it turned out we were awarding the wrong stuff. So anyhow, we sat down and said, well, how are we going to do that? How are we going to find language that describes public radio? And what we decided to do was, why don't we look at the programs our listeners like best and start there. So those are the 7 programs that are in 2000, the most popular programs in public radio. And lo and behold, today they are the top programs in public radio, with a couple of exceptions. Morning edition, and we did not, for purposes of the research, bring in the weekend editions of either morning edition or All Things Considered, because we considered them extensions of the franchise. So we have morning edition, All Things Considered, Prairie Home Companion, Car Talk, Fresh Air, Talking Nation, and Marketplace. Top 7 shows in public radio. We looked at them and just went, what on earth do these shows have in common? We cannot figure out. They're like the Pleiades, if you study astronomy, it's that cluster of stars that kind of hangs together. But what is it? There's a big tall guy who tells stories and loves folk music. There's 2 Weisenheimers from Boston who talk about cars. You have Terry doing her incredible interviews. You have news shows, and then you have this business, and they're all produced in different places. They come from different production houses. They come from stations. They come from at least 2 different networks. So what I decided to do was invite the executive producers of these shows to come together for a day. And I asked them to do 2 things, and they were so skeptical of it, I paid them. The first thing they did, and I fed them, just like this. The first thing I asked them to do was, I wanted them to come with a list of what they aspired their shows to be. Just a simple list of words. What are the, if there were words that pop into your head about what you wanted your show to be, what would they be? So they each came with a list. And then the second half of the day was spent listening to 2 pieces of audio that I asked them to send. One was an example of a show they produced that really hit the mark on that. All of their, it was everything that they wanted the show to be. And it couldn't be the one that had won the Pulitzer. It had to be the one that they worked 3 months on. It had to really represent the day in, day out, week in, week out show. And the other piece of audio was something that just fell short for whatever reason. They didn't even have to tell me why. It was just like, for whatever reason, it just wasn't as good as they wanted it to be. And we spent the afternoon talking about that, and in that way, we got at what it was that they did to maintain this consistent level of quality. So it was a really rich, interesting day. And they all knew each other. I mean, public radio is kind of a small town. but they had never sat down as a group of colleagues and had this discussion. So it was really fascinating. It was really wonderful. And this is what came out of it. These are public radio's core values. When I went to a conference, to the PRPD conference, which runs the only programming conference in public radio, well, that's not true for most of us, actually, it's most I had no idea how people were going to respond to this. But what came out of that discussion were three distinct clusters of qualities. The qualities of the mind and intellect, the qualities of heart and spirit, and the qualities of craft. And the qualities of mind and intellect were really about this vigilant curiosity about the world, a love of lifelong learning, a really strong desire for depth, for accuracy, and they wanted their shows to respect the intelligence of the listener. The qualities of heart and spirit really have more to do with the kind of the attitude of how the audience sees itself in the context of the world, their roles as both citizens of their communities and of the nation and the world. And the qualities there: humor, generosity, inspired about public life and culture, civility and civil discourse, and a belief in our power to find solutions. Solution-oriented. And finally, qualities of craft, which have been lampooned to no end on SNL and other places. A unique human voice, conversational, authentic, intimate. Public radio has a very distinct sound when you hit it on the radio dial. Pacing, and all those things, writing, sound, music. And so all of those 7 shows had those qualities. They mixed them in different amounts. But it's the cross-cutting of those 3 clusters of values that have created the signature of public radio's most popular programs. They all bring intellectual curiosity, some kind of heart and spirit, and a sense of being part of something bigger than just yourself. And then, of course, the unique qualities of craft of public radio. Well, it was kind of a sensation. I mean, this is now in the NPR handbook, and people it just totally resonated with the public radio crowd. And so much so I actually turned them into a pocket card, which you will find taped up in public radio newsrooms around the country. And I brought extra ones in case anybody would like their own particular copy. So the next step, that was what the producers said. Those were their aspirations. The values came out of the producers. The next step was to actually go to stations and talk with listeners and find out how listeners describe the value that they find in public radio programming. And it's probably not a great surprise to anyone, but there's a pretty good match there. And I'm going to show you some. These are key characteristics of the NPR audience. This comes from the most recent, hot off the presses last week, audience handbook. And what you'll see is a lot of resonance with these values. They're more likely than the population as a whole to believe that equal opportunity and working for the welfare of society are very important. This is this public, sense of being part of a greater thing. Generosity of spirit, wanting others to enjoy the same benefits, etc., etc. They are publicly involved. They're more likely to take on a participatory role in their communities. They vote more, they're more active. So this whole business of civic engagement is very, very big with the public radio audience. Highly educated and engaged in lifelong learning. They're committed to learning throughout their lives. It's, again, a tremendous driver for public radio listening. They think if they don't learn something from what we're doing, they're really not terribly interested. And they have great curiosity. That curiosity extends to the world around them. So, and they would use the same language. Oh, I love the depth. I love its humor without being mean-spirited, etc., etc. So it was just a really very strong match between what the producers were hoping for and what the audience valued. And then this political outlook I throw in because I think what you see is a relatively balanced audience. Contrary, certainly on the liberal side, it's represented higher than the population as a whole, but when you look at the audience, it's fairly balanced between the spectrums of very conservative and very liberal. So the values were the same. The other 2 issues that we were looking at were, do listeners expect the same values and standards in the local programming that they get in the national and network shows? Or is it kind of like, well, that's like our team. You know, it's like our local station. We'll give them a pass. Kind of like that indulgent parent. Well, they're not doing great, but we really love them. The short answer is, do they expect the same values and standards? Yes. Do they give you a pass? No. Is localism itself a value, or is origination irrelevant to value? So, and take a sip and move on. Okay, here's what we found. What we found is there is a tremendous growing opportunity for public radio in local news. People are passionate about where they live. There was this other theory, that one of the theories that was sort of on the table, and which we really looked at in depth in Sense of Place, is that this thing about, well, you know, America's becoming homogenized. Everything's the same. There's a Starbucks on every corner, da 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 da. I am here to tell you that it's just totally not true. Places are unique, different, complex, multifaceted, very rich, very interesting. And when you sit down with people and you ask them about where they live, they'll tell you a whole bunch of stuff. They want a comprehensive range of news. That means what's going on where they live, as well as national and international. They may be global citizens, they may be interested in things that are going on all over the world, but where they live is very important to them, and they want information about that as well. And good news for public radios. And again, this is 9 years ago. They were completely turned off by local commercial news, both television and radio, which they called shallow. You know, it was full of hype and sensation. It was loud. It was people yelling at them all the time, and it was manipulative. They felt like they were being jerked around.
So what do you mean with commercial news?
Commercial, local, you know, the local news, local commercial TV news, local commercial radio news. So they really didn't have a lot of outlets that they found satisfying. Unfortunately, we also found a lot of disappointment. We played examples of locally produced programming from around the country. And some of the pieces really got great responses no matter what market you were in. And they had to do with a kind of process that began happening with the listeners, and it happened, I'll describe it in a little bit. Really fascinating. But a lot of them were just like, you know, just kind of like, oh, that's okay, you know, there's nothing special about it. And there really was no particularly advantage to local, where people go, well, local is better because it's local. Not true. And the phrase that popped up a lot in that study was, oh, that's just merely local. You know, it's just like, and in fact, what we found out was, you know, there was a very specific meaning that people had for local, which is of or affecting a part and not the whole. It was limited. It was parochial. And the very word local was like, they would use it as a pejorative. That's local. You know, it's just local. So right after we did this study, I actually ran across a station that was doing a local program called Sounds Local. And I thought, it's probably not the best one. I should probably call them. So anyhow, this is the headline from that study, and it remains the headline today. And it's got a lot of verbosity in it. But public radio listeners, especially those who use an NPR station as their primary choice, those are core listeners, or in commercial what they call Q1s, as their primary choice, see the world as an interconnected web of causal relationships. Now that's kind of a phrase. In their view, no event is isolated on any level, local, national, or international. They want in-depth information so they can think about large issues. So we would play these pieces that they like, and what they would start doing would be, you know, kind of piecing things together. That happens, and that happens here too, and what might happen, and it's a problem, and how can we fix it? Does somebody do that there? And it's just like this whole thing. And when we played a piece that didn't have that, they go, well, you know, it just doesn't. And we came to call that the gesture. They would like make this circle over their heads, and it happened all the time, everywhere, both in this study and in Sense of Place. It was just like, but it doesn't have that. You know, it's missing that. So we would tell people, when you have your editorial meetings, you know, you're pitching a story, do this. Say, are we zooming out enough? Are we really thinking in complex enough terms? And isn't that a wonderful thing? they have in an audience. They don't want you to dumb down and get simple. They want it like more depth, more complexity. So when we ask listeners what requires improvement, the answer is always this: make sense of the news for us. Too many times we are presenting the incremental news story rather than the more important contextual one. And another way of putting this, I did a workshop for my stations in Alaska. They never met each other. I mean, it was just this amazing thing. I had to charter a plane out to Bethel and ship in the food and all this kind of stuff. But I wanted, it was called Too Close for Comfort Reporting in a Small Town. And a lot of my stations were one-person newsrooms, and in predominantly Native communities where they, kind of parachuted in and they were going to be news directors. And one of the people I had come speak was the head of the Association of Village Council Presidents, a Yupik guy from Western Alaska. And the way he put this is, something will run hot and heavy for a few days and then you'll never hear about it again. He said, you feel like you're living on the crest of a wave all the time. And that was his exact way of saying that when you're covering news incrementally, you're not giving people the context. So we really encourage people to do this when they're thinking about a story. What special and unique meaning does this topic have in our community? How does it interconnect our community with the nation and the world? Has it happened before? Has it happened someplace else? Is it part of a pattern? Why is it happening? What's the impact? These are the sorts of things that give you this and give your stories depth and complexity. We did a project in Ella and I with a station in Flagstaff, Arizona, called Poverty with a View. And poverty with a view is a phrase that popped up in research that we did in Flagstaff about what life was like in that community. Very beautiful place. I don't know if you've ever been. Flagstaff is a gorgeous little town. But it's hard to make a living there. The cost of living is very high. And what we found out in the course of doing this long series, which won national awards, it was an experimental partnership between NPR, where we brought in an editor and a producer from NPR to work at the station in residence for a period of time. What we found out was poverty with a view pops up all over the Intermountain West. There are poverty with view t-shirts in Bend, Oregon. Great, is it someplace else? So we were able to go outside of Flagstaff and say, oh, this is really a national issue. Then we discovered the International Amenity-Led Migration Organization, my God, that does study about this all over the world, like in the Alps in France. The same dynamics are happening in all of these different beautiful places where people who have a lot of money are able to live there. They drive up the price of housing, et cetera, get jobs, et cetera. Anyhow, this is like fabulous stuff for public radio listeners because it's just, that's exactly what they're looking for. That's all online, by the way. You go to KNU in Flagstaff, you can actually hear the whole series. So we did this local news study. Public radio listeners are the same all over. If you brought people, they share this incredible set of values. When you bring public radio listeners together, it's just they're like old buds, right? And they'll just sit around, they'll be out in the parking lot after the groups are over. You can't get them to go away. They just love each other. But listeners in a given location may have a particular sense of place. Now, this is an observation of this study. This was not a finding. Listeners in a given location may have a particular sense of place when they think about their local community. Understanding their sense of place may be a prerequisite to the design of truly valuable local programming. We call this the phantom core value. It's like something installed out of the corner of our eye, this whole business of sense of place and how people felt about where they lived, but we couldn't quite put our finger on it. So it took a while, but by Joe, we did a study on it called A Sense of Place, the Value and Values of Localism in Public Radio. This was a very large-scale project. This is what's called the mother of all focus group projects. 9 markets, 400 listeners, and I should say, every focus group we ever did are what are called blind focus groups. I don't think focus groups that know who's doing them have any value whatsoever. So these were very rigorously done. The protocols for the participating stations was incredibly rigorous. We made people come hours ahead of time. They couldn't bring anything that would identify the station in the parking lot. They could not talk to anybody about it. It was just completely, and the moderator, who's just totally fabulous, is as good as anyone I have ever seen in terms of getting a group so focused on what we want them to talk about that they absolutely forget about who's brought them here to do this. So, and I just think that's really, any time you have people who are talking about focus groups, it's very important to know whether or not the groups were singing to the choir or whether they really were just speaking directly from their experience. So anyhow, this is a sense of place. The stations were recruited very deliberately based on, we used Joel Burrow's 9 Nations of North America. Have any of you heard of that? It's a wonderful, if you haven't, you should just Google 9 Nations of North America. It's a way of looking at the country that's much more sophisticated and interesting than just north, south, east, west. He divides it into these 9 nations, and we had 7 of them represented in the study. 3 of them we had small and large market pairs. We really wanted to make sure, because this was such an ephemeral thing, that we had really good, solid information. And we feel we did. So first, defining a couple of terms. Local, back to that word local, which may be different now some years later, I'm not sure. But this is the kind of map you see on newsroom walls. This is really driven by government. This is geographical area within the station signal coverage, typically organized by political boundaries of city and state. And that's really the way a lot of news editorial policies are driven. There's like a city council, county council, the state government, this kind of thing. And that becomes the kind of the framework. Place is something different. It has to do with other dimensions of where people live, the history of the place, the environment, the culture. And I had heard about a guy who was doing what he called a mapping exercise in South Africa. In post-apartheid South Africa, they were starting a lot of new radio services in townships and in very small communities. And he would come in and he would have people draw maps of where they lived as a way of getting at what was important to them. I thought that was really fascinating. And a friend of mine who does similar work did the same thing after the study in Mongolia and sent me pictures of his Mongolian radio listeners drawing their maps. It's very cool. So we showed the people in the focus groups this map. This is a very famous New Yorker cover review from Ninth Avenue. It's very funny. And then we showed him another one because it was kind of 2 different takes for the same place. This is New York State, which was done not long after 9/11. I always think it's the first time I laughed really hard after 9/11. This is a fabulous piece of work. And they recognized the covers, and they had shower curtains with them. I mean, they just, they really were, they grokked the whole concept of this completely. So we gave people big pieces of paper and pens, and we just said, draw a map. And I'm going to show you just a few of the maps that people do. This is Las Vegas. Now, Las Vegas is a pretty strange community for public radio. I actually, when I showed this slide someplace else, and the guy who loaded the PowerPoint called me up. He said, "Are you sure? Is that supposed to be Palace?" I said, "No, that's not true." It's a wonderful map. Look how big the airport is. And Las Vegas is an interesting community because this is not a classic public radio community. When you look at the Valley, there's not a big liberal arts university. There's no state capital. These are like the convening institutions for public radio listeners. It's where you find the richest audiences. I mean, not rich monetarily, but just kind of richest in the number of potential listeners. So these are lonely people. I mean, the public radio listeners are atomized across Las Vegas. And I swear, when they met each other in focus groups, they just did not want to meet each other. It was like, I can't find anybody. Many were trailing spouses. It wasn't their first choice to live in Las Vegas. And they really saw their town as a place that was basically invaded. I mean, this is an invasion force. You can see the tourists and there's a lot of frat boys come and throw up on the sidewalks and leave, kind of like whatever that movie was. Exactly. They loved the desert. The desert was very important. They often would, go out into the environment of the desert, so they loved the desert environment. And the airport, because it not only brought all these people into town, but it allowed them to get out of town. So that was one market. So that's a really interesting set of challenges. Here's Flagstaff. Totally different situation, not very far away. But there's Flagstaff, this mountain oasis with its clear skies and its fresh water, down below the brown clouds of Phoenix and the brown clouds of Los Angeles. But there's trouble in paradise. This is another Flagstaff now. Again, as people are attracted to these beautiful areas, the price of housing goes up, the development goes up, the traffic gets worse, and you'll notice gas, $5 a gallon. This is the warning bell about the cost of living in Flagstaff. Then we have Milwaukee. Milwaukee's part of the Rust Belt. It's a community that is, really struggling. And this is a set of the old ethnic communities where they all had their own churches and they all had their own bars. And it's, it's really a struggling place. So really different takes. I mean, again, sense of place very, very different in all of these different places. This is long-standing, local population, but economically just really having a hard time. So here's what came out of the stations where these maps are from. KNPR in Las Vegas saw a real opportunity to really talk about community to their listeners, which were really having trouble finding community and feeling a sense of community. And they have become incredibly active in civic engagement. They have become a convener for their listeners. They do a lot of events. They do a lot of things. And they continually explore what it means to live in this place, what it is to be there, and what it is to be part of a community that really has such a huge and constant influx of people into it. Poverty with You I talked about. This series, not only, it was a huge series, it was like 6 parts and 3 talk shows and God knows what else. What they do is they create an editorial frame that you can revisit all the time, because these are kind of eternal issues. These are things that really don't change very quickly. Like Milwaukee, Project Milwaukee is a major ongoing radio series that they do, creating a vibrant regional economy, and they look at a lot of different, take a look at it from a lot of different angles. An example, the currency of water, where they wanted to become a hub for projects that have to do with water. So for the participating stations, this was really a powerful project. It gave them a tremendous amount of information about their audience, and it gave their newsroom not only editorial tools, but a kind of editorial frame about sense of place, which allowed them to look at issues from this larger perspective of what it meant and get away from the hamster wheel of incremental coverage, which is a real curse of our business, which I will mention now. How many of you have read this study, How News Happens, a study of the news ecosystem in one American city? Run to your computers and read about this, because this is the news system of America right now. There's one study, I will say, simply one study, done in January of this year, but I will tell you from the work that I've done over 10 years, it totally is resonant with here's the big findings of it. They studied a set of stories in the Baltimore market, local stories. This is all on local. What they found is that 8 out of 10 stories simply repeated or repackaged previously published information. Almost all of the stories with new information came from newspapers as papers cut back, 30% drop in audience for newspapers in the last 10 years. Reproducing other people's work plays a bigger role. Government, the big initiator, 63%. Interest groups, 23%. The press, 14%. That's it, of news that was initiated by reporters. The rest of it is basically reviewers. As news is posted faster, as the cycle gets faster, as this pressure to be first, to break news. As this speeds up, as news is posted faster, often with little enterprise reporting added, the official version of events is becoming more important. Official press releases often appear word for word in first accounts of events, though not often noted as such. This study looked at all platforms. They looked at print, radio, television, and online. And what they found is that while the number of sources of news and information is increasing, the centralization of the message is becoming more and more powerful. And whoever says it first, everybody else says it after them. And it becomes like parrot chatter. I mean, I'm sure you've noticed this happen in the newsroom. And it's very hard once that comes out to correct it. Nobody pays it. Often corrections aren't run, nobody knows. I mean, that's sort of like the worst case scenario. But this is a scary environment for information dissemination. The good news on the public radio side is that there are at least 3 major new initiatives that are aimed at local news that should really beef up the resources and deepen the quality of local news. One of them is the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has launched a $10 million plus local journalism center project that has set up news hubs around the country, which is very exciting. I think there's 6 of them, right, Lola, altogether? We were talking about that last night. And some of them are really geographically driven. I think the strongest ones are going to be the ones that are based around the environment. And there's one on the environment in the Northwest. There's one on the Rust Belt, on Milwaukee, for example, that looks at the Rust Belt economy. Another one is looking largely at immigration issues in the Southwest. So those are now really just starting to get up and running and hiring. The second is something called impact of government, which, yay, is going to look at state house reporting and other kinds of things like that in a really intensive way. That's a project that's going to be run out of NPR with stations. And finally is an initiative that's been launched by stations themselves, really the largest, most powerful, most sophisticated stations in the country have made a commitment, a public commitment, to create 100-person newsrooms in their radio stations. This is a big deal for public radio. This is like New York, Minnesota Public Radio, KPCC, WBEC in Chicago, WNYC in New York. This is a really ground-moving, use an LA metaphor, event. So these are all really good things. This gives public radio a real chance to do enterprise work. So that's basically it, and there should be time for questions and whatever. I stunned you into the lunch has got to do.
I'm going to ask a question that I actually asked Marcia earlier, which is how, to what extent diversity figured into the diversity of audiences figured into any of the research that you did?
None of the research projects were done specifically to look at diversity. There have been studies done in the past, and there certainly is a major initiative underway in public radio to do that. The nature, I don't know, there was a slide up there that looked at the percentage of public radio listening by terms of degree of education degrees. It's a frighteningly educated audience. I mean, kind of terrifying in that sense. And then that really is the driver for public radio listening. Although the qualities of listening are not limited to that. Let me start at the beginning. Radio is an incredibly targeted medium. If you think about the way you travel across the radio band, if you're like me, you go, hate it, hate it, hate it. Oh, that's yeah. Banger, heavy metal rock, no. So stations, in fact, one of the stories I told Willa is that many years ago, I was with a commercial radio station program director. We were going to go out to lunch. And I said, oh, why don't we go over here? And he said, I don't go there, our listeners don't go there. I mean, he just basically lived his audience. That was so important to him. And so it's not surprising that audiences have, that stations have audiences of quite specific definition. Public radio, however, is not doing what it should in terms of diversity. And one of the there are several reasons for that. One is that, look at MTV, for example. MTV, there's like how many slices and dices of MTV? Like 6, 7 different channels of MTV. ESPN has like 7 channels of ESPN. In radio, the only way we could expand and do new streams of programming was to get a radio frequency, which were prohibitively expensive. The good news is we live in a digital era, and that is beginning to change the landscape of public radio. And you find, even though it's not a huge change, you find that the audience online is more racially diverse than the broadcast, even though the broadcast audience is the driver to online. And even though the education level for online is still incredibly high. It is, so there is something about the way public radio is done now that is some kind of screen and filter. It can be attitude, it could be, I mean, like I said, I think there's considerable research. But I think the answer is different streams of programming that really are, in the nature of the business itself, more targeted. The other thing I want to throw out, just sort of as a question about, is when we talk about public radio's lack of diversity, I think we need to be careful about what we're talking about. I mean, I think Terry Gross's show, for example, is probably one of the widest nets culturally in the country. Her show is the highest podcast audience for NPR, far and away. Some shows are more welcoming than others. I think that would be an interesting thing to look at. Again, instead of kind of going, oh my God, what do we do? Let's look at where our successes are and see what it is that they might do differently. I think Marketplace has a distinctly different tone. It's, for want of a better word, cheekier. You know, it's got more humor. It's a little bit more playful. So I think in public, I think This American Life is a different show. And can anybody tell me, there is one show that has been added to the top, that is actually the only breakaway hit we've had in 10 years. Can anybody tell me what it is? Public radio show?
Wait, don't tell.
Wait, don't tell me.
Don't tell. Yeah.
Which is produced by Doug Berman, who did Cartoon.
Right.
So I mean, that's the other thing is the shelf space. And every time you want to put something on, you have to take something off. So it's a zero-sum game when you're talking about public radio programming. So there's been a lot of it's part of the two-edged thing of success. Is that as you succeed, you're just less likely to take risks and make changes. I mean, those 7 shows. But Garrison's not getting any younger. And Terry, God love her. I mean, she can't do this forever, right? I mean, maybe she could. I don't know. The Car Talk guys are not going to be doing that. But there's going to be opportunity and change. I think it will come. It's inevitable that it comes. But I do think we could do some real soul searching about how vibrant our sourcing is. Are we really looking as broadly as we can to the experts that we bring onto the air? Or are we talking to the usual suspects? And I don't think there's any doubt that our sourcing is not as diverse and as rich as it, and it's a puzzle to me. I don't know why. I really don't know why.
Well, one of the current experiments on bringing diversity to the public radio audience is Vocalo, the Chicago Public Radio has developed and is working in northwest Indiana. How do you think that's going, and is that a model for other places?
I don't know how Vocalo is going. You know, I think it's a great experiment, but I really don't know. I'm not privy to their audience data, and I'm not sure how it's going. What surprised me, I told Willa about this, in 2001, the year that we did the local research, and the year we were going to present it, our conference was, in 2001, it was scheduled for September 12th in Baltimore, Maryland. And of course, as you all know, the day before that, the day I had 500 people heading to airports around the country on 9/11 happened. And it delayed, I think if we had, I mean, I don't know, that really threw a lot of things off in terms of the freshness of the research and our ability to really talk with people about it. One of the guys that I had invited to speak at the conference was a young guy who taught in East Harlem who was running an internet radio station. I said, look, why aren't we running internet radio stations? Why aren't we doing streams as he was doing a predominantly Hispanic high school in East Harlem in New York? Why aren't we, because you're not going to take Terry Gross off the air, and you're not going to take Garrison off the air, and you're not going to take Morning Edition off the air. But the digital world, even as far back as 2001, gave us tremendous opportunities to aggregate different types of service and offer them. And it's, you know, it's a big, complicated institution. I mean, public radio's blessing and its curse is that it is just so decentralized. You've got all these stations, they're all their own universes, you've got 3 different networks, you've got independent producers, it's a really complex system. And as a result, getting all the horses to pull together and move in one direction is something of a challenge. But I do think, and I'm optimistic, that as the generation that built the system that exists, which has been a tremendous success story. I mean, unbelievable. If you look at that chart on media use, I mean, it's just astonishing. But it's not the future. The future is going to be you guys. You guys are the future. You're the ones who are going to build the public radio service in the future. And it's going to sound different. It's going to be different. It should be. I hope I am able to live long enough to hear it. Yeah.
You talked about the decentralized nature of public radio, but I want to know about what's your opinion on the concentration of media ownership. For example, Clear Channel Communications used to own 56 radio stations back in 1996, and right now they own more than 1,400 news radio stations in America. And because of that, a lot of local stations actually run feeds, tape feeds, instead of having someone to
kind of like homogenized news that's then pumped out to.
So I just wonder, what's your view on that? And do
I
you
think
view your project as part of the media reform or of any sort?
Well, media reform is a little outside of my area of influence, shall we say? I mean, I think it's unfortunate. I mean, I think it's an unfortunate development. I think what we're seeing, again, and this Baltimore study really reflects it, is that if we thought that by virtue of increasing the number of sources of information, that we were going to get better information, we were wrong about that. That's not indeed what's happening. I mean, I think there is more and better information, but it's such a blizzard out there. It's just really hard to find. I mean, again, and I think that's one of public radio's strengths. It's kind of got a really strong identity and signature at this point. For all of its problems, or all of its failings, or all of the things it needs to do, it is a rational discussion, an in-depth discussion of the complexity of our world. So, I mean, Clear Channel's been, a monster, I shouldn't say monster, but I mean a big growing enterprise for a long time. It's just I never think about it. I don't listen to it. I'm not a listener.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So as the baby boomers group is still growing, you're trying to attract that core group as well, right? But at the same time, you're trying to balance the local news
thank you for
for
asking
the
that
younger
question.
generation. So how do you balance it out?
What we found is, in fact, I met one right before, is that as public radio is a mature audience, there's no question about it. The average age is around 50, which is older than the U.S. population. But what we have found is that as people age, depending on this value set, they come into the audience. It's not that, how many of you, your parents listen to NPR? How many? Yeah. What we found as we've done research is there's at least one generation of what we call NPR babies. And these are the people whose parents tormented them in the car with these long 9-minute interviews about Poland. They really wanted to listen to his rock and roll. But as they've gotten older, and they're looking for in-depth information, they have come into the audience. And they're coming into the audience in the proportion that you would expect. But it is, I mean...
But are they coming in through the radio or through...
They're coming in, the radio's still the driver. When you look at the pattern of listening, now, I'm not a total expert on this, so I'm going to throw a caveat out this, but my understanding, the way that I've seen the numbers, is that the primary driver is still the radio source. It's the entry point. And people, and that's, to me, a really important thing is that it's all content, and the content, it doesn't matter if it's not very good on the radio, it's not going to get any better when you put it online. I mean, it just has to be, if that's going to be the main entry point, and that's the conduit for people to experience that the information has just got to be strong. We don't know what's going to happen to radio. I mean, does radio matter? It does right now. Yeah. Will it matter in 10 years? I don't know. Some people say it won't. I suspect, this is just my own, and it's certainly not a unique theory, but there is something unique about the experience of radio. When they first started, remember when they introduced multimedia into the library system, and the kids would come in and they'd play with like film and all that. They found that they had a tremendous difficult time working with audio. Audio is incredibly sophisticated to work with. If you've ever gone out and done a story and you come back with all this audio and you're trying to find your way through it to get the story, and it's just like, oh, I'm lost, where am I? It's very difficult. Now, great, you have digital editing, you can see. But there's just something unique about the experience of having to be in your head instead of on a page, on a screen. There's an intimacy there. And I don't know if anybody now has the kind of experience I did when I was growing up, very small mining town up in northern Minnesota. And the way the FCC divvied up the channels, there were these clear channel, not clear channel, but clear channel stations, 50,000 watt, K8AY in Little Rock, WLS in Chicago, WCCO in Minneapolis, and you could hear these stations all over the country at night. I mean, they were incredibly powerful. So I'm in this little, podunk mining town, and I'm hearing WLS in Chicago. It's like, wow, it's just like and I just kept thinking, I'm going to get there sometime. I'm going to get there. And I don't know, it's a different, it's more visceral, I think there's a power there that we would miss if radio went away. That could be just because I'm a codger, but I don't know. I like to think that it's lasted through a lot of threats. I mean, television came in, radio's dead. Radio changed. Now television, cable TV came in, television changed. And it's all about the focusing of programming, the focusing of formats. You don't have those, university stage, lectures of the air became public radio today. Old TV shows, the Happy Homemakers, that became targeted channels. It's just kind of the nature of change.
I do have a question, and I don't know if this is a stupid question, I'll preface it with that.
Well, I give you a stupid answer.
Well, thank you. I've always wondered, because my mom did listen to NPR, and I went to Annenberg, so I had to listen to it for class. But then for 10 plus years, didn't have a car, didn't seek it out. But now I listen to it every day to and from work. And my assumption is that the people who are in the lower demographic or in the demographic that aren't listening to NPR, I'm wondering if it's that they've ever listened and were turned off and chose to listen to something else, or they're just not in the word of mouth circle. Because I've talked to people and they say, I don't know what NPR is.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's this fabulous gift, and that I'm glad that it's becoming more diverse and people can reach it different ways, but it's still kind of the light under the bushel.
Yeah. Well, it's never really advertised. I mean, you know, when you look at the advertising and the R&D budgets for HBO or any, they're huge. And public radio's just never had it, you know. It just took all the money you had just to do the programming, right? You couldn't really tell anybody about it. And I think that's, you know, it's definitely a factor. One of the experiences I remember best from listening was I had this office on Venice Beach for 10 years. Lucky me. Except when those panpipers who only knew one song still have outside the office. And David Isay, who's a wonderful independent producer, did StoryCorps, did Ghetto Life 101, which is just one of the most amazing radio centers ever produced. He did something called the execution tapes. He had gotten a hold of a recording of the actual conversation that was going on to authorize an execution. Just made the hair stand up on that, and that was, I talked about it. And so I knew KCRW was carrying it, and I turned it on in my office, and I started hearing this kind of echo, like if you have a radio on in one room and you have a radio on in the other room, like, oh. And I looked out the window, and the guys who ran the little shops in the arcade, largely Middle Eastern guys, had set a radio up in the center of the arcade with this program on it. And it was, you know, classic LA, Venice Beach, you know, audience, like great, wonderful, diverse crowd, glued to the radio. So I'm convinced that public radio can deliver programming that resonates in that way across
Absolutely.
the culture.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying, is I think that you've already built it, but how are you going to get them to come? Because I think relying on word of mouth is not enough.
There's a mobile station right near my house that, you know, it pipes in when you're getting your gas. You hear NPR. And it's always so stunning to me because usually you don't hear it in those kinds of settings.
But I have to tell you, having started in public radio in 1973, I always say it was like being part of a Druid cult, you know. I mean, nobody had ever heard had ever heard NPR. And you'd say, well, I work for this thing called public radio. Well, what's that? And now you can't say NPR without people knowing what it is. So in that sense, there is greater recognition, but I think there are probably tremendous segments of the population. I mean, Tavis Smiley said that when he left NPR. He said, you wouldn't believe how many people I talked to who never heard public radio. Well, that's a real failing on our parts if we're not doing that kind of work. But again, the restriction of resources and that sort of thing. You're not going to see big ad campaigns.
Unfortunately, we have to stop.
Okay, that's it.
Thank you. Taken over. Thank you, Marcia.
Guys.